All right, well, we are recording today. So welcome. We are going to cover today not all of the rest of section 3 in SOSI, but I hope a whole bunch of the rest of section 3. We're going to try to get through section 3. If not today, then certainly by Monday of next week, and then we'll wrap it all up and we'll be able to go and finish section 4 is actually very short. So the end of SOSI is in sight in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to share my screen. When last we left our intrepid explorers, we literally went over the Federalist Papers, right? That was kind of where we were right there. Because it turns out that since we were discussing the concept of why we should accept the Constitution, which I keep saying, spoiler alert, we do accept the Constitution. We zipped over to literature for a couple of days to talk about these essays that were written in support of the literature. So we detoured, we went to the literature, and now welcome back to the age of jive. Welcome back to the actual where the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, and the Federalists are gonna win. But why? What's going on? Well, at first, the Constitution seemed to have a lot of public support. In fact, between when it was really proposed, remember the Shays Rebellion happens, people are like, wow, this is problematic. We need a stronger federal government now that the war has been over for almost 5 years. And so 5 states actually voted to approve it. Delaware, New Jersey, and Georgia voted unanimously to just approve it as written. Go Constitution, that Connecticut Compromise, with the 2 houses of legislature, a sort of Republican rather than truly Democratic government, where we voted for the people who then voted for the Judiciary Board and the president. It's a republic rather than a true democracy. Pennsylvania and Connecticut also both voted pretty heavily and quickly in favor of adopting the Constitution. But Massachusetts did not go all in. Why did Massachusetts resist the Constitution? Well, first of all, 2 of their major leaders, John Hancock and Samuel Adams, were anti-federalists. John Hancock was very much of the merchant class, the mercantile class, you may have heard it said. Samuel Adams was the less successful cousin of John Adams, and neither one of them was really, they liked Massachusetts as Massachusetts, right? Keep Massachusetts the way of Massachusetts, and did not necessarily want to go all in with the feds. Not only that, but a state legislature, which is the ones that are voting on whether or not to ratify the Constitution, are comprised of people from, that's right, all over the entire state. And fun fact, when the western half of Massachusetts has just had an enormous rebellion and not wanted to be put down by a federal army, those representatives are not keen on voting to give other people more power. Right? That makes sense. And so a huge number of people in Western Massachusetts voted against it. It ended up passing, but on a vote of 187 to 168. And remember that as part of the adoption of the Constitution, it's written into it that at least 2/3 of the states, or 9 out of the 13 states, need to approve it. And so if Massachusetts is so close, this was problematic. What ended up passing it for Massachusetts was that there was this really weird alliance in the legislature between the really elite nationalists. You think about that rhetoric that was used in those 85 essays that were written. Only the most elite people could understand them. My mom and I were just talking about that this morning, that if you want somebody to understand things, you don't write it like Hamilton and Madison do. Combined with urban workers who really didn't care about what was happening in Western Massachusetts nearly so much. They united with some artisans being like silversmiths and leather workers and, people who made clothing and whatever, all these artisans, because they were hoping that if there was a strong national identity and a strong federal government, that the federal government would impose tariffs or taxes on things like British imports. If you have a national identity, you by nature have sort of a worry or a thought or a feeling about other countries. If you're a state, you don't really care as much about other countries that are far away. But if you are an entire national government, you may create foreign policy. And one of the ways that foreign policy helps local artisans is that they might tax imports coming in and make those imports more expensive, so that anybody who wants to buy a silver teapot from England has to pay a tax that they would not have to pay if they bought a local made, American made teapot, for example. And that being said, they were sort of hoping that financially speaking, they would get a boost, these artisans. So they had this sort of kind of odd alliance of people who were, really pro-nationalists, people who were looking out for their own economic interests, urban workers who didn't really care what was happening anywhere else. And this is actually a cartoon that was published in Boston after the ratification of the Constitution, sort of saying, look, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut all voted for it, but if Massachusetts doesn't, boom, that that whole structure will fall. And this is a thank you to the people who voted for it, thanks to the candor of those gentlemen who at first were opposed to its whatever that says, correction, and who have now ratified it. Okay, so this is it. It gets in. Speaking of what happened before it was passed in Massachusetts, two delegates actually got into a fist fight. Federalist Francis Dana and anti-federalist Elbridge Gerry. I'm sure that'll be a question somewhere along the way, but it's a really small question. It just was really, really contentious, let's just say. And the reason it ended up being passed, and even the anti-federalists were okay to support it, was that there was a compromise proposed by the anti-federalists in Boston, in Massachusetts, Hancock and Adams, we just talked about them on the last slide, that basically guaranteed those individual rights. And I spoiled this when we talked about it before, but essentially the anti-federalists, what they were most worried about were losing their own individual rights. And by putting those individual rights into the Constitution as part of what they were accepting, all of the states that followed, right? 5 states had passed it, Massachusetts. So there were still 7 states left. And basically by putting in this list of individual rights, not just rights of the federal government and the state governments, but by putting in rights for the individuals, it convinced a lot of anti-federalists to accept this new Constitution. So they proposed actually a lot of amendments. We'll talk about, I think it's 23. And then each legislature kind of debated them, and they ended up accepting 10 of them. So the 10 amendments, and we're going to talk about them on the next couple of slides, but those 10 amendments became part of what was ratified as part of the Constitution itself. So the Constitution and the first 10 amendments were sort of accepted simultaneously. It was crucial to the victory in New York and in Virginia. Only Maryland passed it without accepting the amendments. Essentially, it got to 9 states saying yes to the new Constitution as of June 1788. So we ended the war in 1783. Then we have Shays' Rebellion. And then this is passed moderately quickly, right? The Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers are published. hang on one second as I go back to find the date for the Federalist and Anti-Federalist. 1787, I think, no, when are they? I don't remember when they're published. I will let someone else come up with that. But essentially they get ratified officially because 9 states approve them. 1788 September, they are put into effect in March of the next year, 1789. And Rhode Island approved them not until after they were ratified on May 29th of 1790, May 29th being my mother's birthday, 1790 not having anything to do with my mother whatsoever. Okay, so once the Constitution gets enacted, Congress had to pick the leader of the executive branch, which is the fancy name for the president. So let me say that again. The Constitution is enacted and in March of 1789, and Congress, I think March, did I just say March of 1789? So March of 1789. And now they have to pick the president. Technically, we still do this. We pick the electors who pick the president of the United States. Every 4 years, we have a big fight about the Electoral College and whether we should go to a like straight 1-to-1 vote so that like if you get more votes on the national level, you win the presidency. This was the major argument in 2016 when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College vote because of the way those votes were distributed. She won more people on the coasts, but they couldn't vote over their number of electors. So she lost the election to Trump. This is a discussion that comes up every 4 years. Undoubtedly, it will come up in another year and a half. George Washington receives the highest number of votes. So they enact the Constitution, yay, and they choose George Washington. He received the highest number of votes. We're going to talk about this because everybody back then could cast 2 votes for president. Technically, he actually won all of the Electoral College votes. Everybody voted for him using both of their votes, and has become the only unanimously elected president in our entire nation's history, but the packet doesn't talk about that. So I'll just throw that out there. John Adams was the runner-up and becomes the vice president. This is not how it is done anymore. We learned from the first 3 elections that it was a really, really bad idea to have the guy you were running against be your second in command. Not because, I mean, that the idea, great idea, bad execution. The idea was if you had the runner-up, the loser, be the second in command, you would force compromise on the government. Turns out that people don't like to work with the people that they just were hating 5 minutes ago. You know, if you think about the last few elections and think about what it would mean to have, you know, Trump as president and Hillary Clinton as vice president, or Biden as president and Trump as vice president, you will get a sense of why that's doesn't work well. Okay, so basically they choose George Washington. He sort of somewhat reluctantly accepts the presidency, and he's like, okay, look, we have to, this is a quote from the packet, we have to really reverence the rights of free men. Well, we're not going to say slaves. This is what he said in his inaugural address. We want public harmony. We want to quickly and safely fortify our individual rights and promote them as such. So, boom. Whoops, come back. Okay, so James Madison originally was against adopting the amendments themselves, but he started to see the necessity for protecting individual rights, and he starts to see this sort of wisdom in doing this. So, 19, I think I said 23 a little earlier. So James Madison writes down all the amendments and sends 19 of them to the House of Representatives. So we've adopted the Constitution here. Which ones of these we said we were going to do a Bill of Rights? We got this. Which ones do we want to do it? Congress debated and revised and edited and sent 12 amendments to the states to debate and put as part of the Constitution. And the 10 that became ratified became known as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. It both guaranteed personal freedoms and rights, and it set limitations on the federal government's power. And that is how this got adopted. So let's talk about the Bill of Rights. What are the first 10 amendments? Okay, so the first 3 are known as yes.
Weren't those approved originally? Is this?
Yes, as I'm saying this, I realize that I don't quite have the timeline. I think everybody approved it saying we need these to be enacted, but I think that they sort of did it. You know what? Let me check into that, because I don't know how they both accepted the Constitution and also didn't, like, had 12 of them to decide and only picked 10.
Thank you.
So it's a good question, and I don't know exactly. Okay, so let's talk about the first 3 of the 10 amendments are known as the safeguards of liberty. They are the really the most individual in terms of the rights of individuals. So the First Amendment, we usually say it in the positive. We guarantee the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press, and the freedom to assemble. We usually talk about it in the positive. What the First Amendment really is the reverse. It prohibits, it's a negative amendment. It prohibits the federal government from restricting religion, speech, press, assembly, or petitioning the government. So instead of saying you have the right to freedom of speech, it says the government can't stop you from speaking freely. We're going to remember that at the end of section 3, when John Adams is like, you can't say bad things, but newspapers can't publish bad stuff about the American government, which clearly violates this First Amendment. So it basically says the federal government cannot favor any one religion. There's no official national religion the way that there is in so many countries. The federal government cannot limit your speech, although the Supreme Court has said, like, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater kind of thing. Federal government cannot muzzle the press, which again, going to come up again the end of this century. And you have the right, the federal government can't prohibit you from gathering together in protest. That's what assembly means. And that's a real big January 6th question. The Second Amendment protects the rights of individuals to keep and bear arms in support of a militia. Not for personal self-defense, but in support of a militia. Several of the states wanted this, mostly because this is right 1789. So literally 7, 8, 9 years ago, they were literally grabbing the guns that they owned to go physically fight with the Brits. So they wanted to be able to form a militia if anyone attacked, normally from without. But it was a real pushback against the British, not redcoats, but regulars, the British soldiers, who would take weapons from the colonists, right? They were Fort Ticonderoga. They would confiscate weapons from the Americans. The Third Amendment is something that, again, absolutely came out of the concept of having the Brits there within a few years. Because it's something that would never occur to any of us to demand, to be part of this. So the Third Amendment prohibits the government from making you take soldiers and house them in your house, feed them, clothe them, shelter them, everything else. Now, all of us who are here are like, when has a soldier or a group of soldiers ever come to our door, ever knocked on our door and been like, hi, we're taking over this house? Never. But because it happened a lot during the Revolutionary War, they put that in as a protection. Americans will never, ever, ever have to do that. So that's the first 3 amendments. All right. Amendments 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, the next 5, the packet does not suss them out individually, but I put them onto my slideshow a little bit to help you remember them. If the first 3 are called the safeguards of liberty, the next 5 are called the safeguards of justice. And their objective was to protect anyone who was accused of a crime. They wanted to make sure that everybody was given the right to for example, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. They hated that the Brits could just come in and take whatever they wanted and check your house for whatever they wanted. The Fifth Amendment protected you from self-incrimination. When you say, I plead the Fifth, it means you don't have to answer a question if you think that it's going to show how guilty you are. It guaranteed you the right to a speedy trial, so you couldn't linger in jail for days, weeks, months, or years, and a just trial, meaning that you had the trial of in front of a jury of your peers, for example. All of that was actually put into these amendments because they were against what had been done to them by the Brits, that had these sort of kangaroo courts that would just convict people far, far and away. It also prevented cruel and that is a very big question when we talk about the death penalty. That is not mentioned in the packet at all, but this idea of what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. We talked about tarring and feathering. Is that cruel and unusual? Is the firing squad cruel and unusual? If you are put to death in modern day in America using a cocktail of drugs, is that considered cruel and unusual? Do you hurt when that happens to you? So all of that is in the next 5 amendments out of the 10, and the final 2 amendments, 9 and 10, are unenumerated rights. Un meaning not, and enumerated meaning numbered. So rights that aren't explicitly already stated in 1 through 8 are protected by these last 2 rights. In other words, the Constitution in the 9th Amendment was like, you know what, we haven't been able to list everything here. If we did, number 1, this document would be 2,000 pages long, but number 2, there are possibly and probably rights that will be understood or will be developed or will be acknowledged in the years to come that we can't fathom. For example, the rights of people of color not to be slaves, just for one example. So it recognizes that 9th Amendment says, you know what, there are rights that aren't listed here, aren't enumerated here. And so they basically said, okay, anything that is not listed here still could get covered under these rights. If it's a basic human right, it's protected. And the quote from the packet states, since 1791, the Supreme Court has established additional rights, including travel, voting, privacy, and, quote, the right to make decisions about one's body or healthcare. And we all may or may not be aware, nope, dog, come here. We may or may not be aware that since the publication of this guide, things have been discussed by the Supreme Court. That is no longer a right that is guaranteed to everybody, that idea of one's body and healthcare. Moving on to the 10th Amendment, it basically says, okay, individuals might get more rights over the course of the next, God only knows how many hundreds of years we hope to be a country, The federal government doesn't get any more protection than what it has right now. Whatever's in this document, that's it. Individuals can do other things, but if we didn't list it here specifically, the states get to decide it, not the feds. And that is in fact what kicked back to, come here, dog. That is in fact what kicked back the new decision regarding abortion, which was not that it is illegal, but that it is a state's decision, that it goes back to the states. All right, moving on. So George Washington is now the president of the United States, and what's happening in the US that Washington has to deal with? Okay, well, there's still an economic crisis that's going on. That is what precipitated Shays' Rebellion in the first place, was this idea that the federal government, or everybody was in huge amounts of debt, and people were raising taxes or trying to pass debtors laws or all kinds of stuff. So Shays had fought against this. That economic crisis was not resolved by adopting the Constitution. Number two, there's a revolution going on in France. 1789, the French are like, overthrow the monarchy, give people the power. And that's going to come up more and more, because the French were like, hey, remember how we helped you with your revolution? It's time to come back and help us with our revolution. We would also like to fight, be the people. So that's going on. And there was a question of whether we should get involved in France or not. That French Revolution sparked a separate war between France and Britain. The fact that none of us have been alive when, I take that back. If you count World War II, a couple people on this call were barely alive. One person on this call was barely alive when France and Britain were at war, but that was mostly because France was taken over by Germany. Everybody, and she doesn't remember this war. So really in our lifetimes, France and Britain have just been friends, frenzies. But that was, like if it was Tuesday, they were at war for 1,000 years. So that's just this is an unusual period of time. If France and Britain go to war, it'll go back to like the way that it has been for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So there's a war between France and Britain. Do we want to get involved with that? Do we not want to get involved with that? If we get involved with that, whose side is it on? Is it affecting us monetarily? There's a lot of stuff going on there. And finally, like all those Native Americans that lived here, there's tensions all up and down what was our Western edge, past the Appalachians, kind of, beyond like near the Mississippi. Yeah, that's all happening too. So all those alliances that helped to pass the Constitution and ratify it really dissolved very quickly. Washington takes over, and he's very, very aware that the precedents that he sets as president are going to be echoed through other administrations, hopefully throughout the very long life of this country. So he's very aware that by going first, he sort of has to set an example. All of you who are oldest children may feel this at a core level. He made an inaugural address. He spoke to the people, which had never been done before, wasn't in the Constitution. It's something you had to do, but every president since then has made an inaugural address. He appointed people to an executive cabinet. It didn't say what he had to have in, like which positions he had to have in his executive cabinet, but he decided that he would have advisors who could help him along. And he spoke every year to Congress and sort of told them, we call it the State of the Union, and we have a State of the State and things like that. But we have, he spoke to Congress and decided this. All right. And he had a pretty successful first term. He appointed 3 people you already know as part of his cabinet. He appointed Henry Knox. We remember him from Fort Ticonderoga. He's going to be the Secretary of War. He appoints Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State, which is a weirdly named position, because the Secretary of State is actually like the international affairs person. I don't know why it's called the Secretary of State. It's really about international stuff. And then he appoints Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, which is why it's kind of sad when they talked about putting Harriet Tubman's face on one of the American bills to celebrate white men and founders of our nation and people that we really look up to, they really had a choice to put her face on any of the bills. The correct choice would, in my humble opinion, the correct choice would have been at the 20, which has Jackson on it, who was like the most horrible president maybe that we've almost ever had, Trail of Tears guy, all that stuff. And instead they talked about putting her on the $10 bill, which is where Alexander Hamilton is, which is kind of depressing because he literally is going to be huge in terms of the treasury and in what we do. I mean, he is Mr. Money Guy right there. Okay, so Washington's major challenges were all those things we talked about, and he had some opinions on how things should be solved. So number one was he hated political parties. He hated them. He thought that they would undermine the new republic. Pro tip, he was right. At first, there weren't really any, but they devolved very quickly into factions, into political parties. Remember, this is what Madison in Federalist 10 paper was like, you can't stop factions from forming, you just have to limit their effects. And true to form, like 5 seconds after he was elected, we were like, oh, we should form factions. It broke into a party called the Friends of the Order that really focused on federal stability and a structured political system. It says let by Hamilton. It should say led by Hamilton and John Adams, who was the vice president. They were Federalists and they became known as Friends of the Order. Think about the order. They were sort of, we should control, the federal government should control everything. They were very good friends of the order, then wanted like dominating order from the top down. It'll later take on the name the Federalist Party, because if you have name recognition, why not just go with it? So they were Federalists, they approved the Constitution, they were called the Friends of the Order, and they're going to go back to being called the Federalists as a political party in the next election and a half from now. On the other side were basically the anti-federalists, who got known as the Friends of Liberty, right? Because they wanted states' rights, which guaranteed more individual rights up until the Bill of Rights was passed. They wanted to limit federal power. It was led by Thomas Jefferson, who was going to come up in just a second here. It will later, confusingly, be known as the Democratic Republican Party. The Democratic Republican Party. I don't know why we can't come up with new names for everything, but that's the way that we're going. Okay. So let's talk about Alexander Hamilton. They don't go very deeply into him, but we're gonna do a little pause while we do some economics as well. So Alexander Hamilton is born in the West Indies. While he was there, he was an apprentice to a prominent mercantile firm, which is just a fancy name for saying he was in trade, imports and exports and stuff like that. And in his free time, because he was such a fun and exciting guy, he read about economics principles. That's, I don't know, apparently how to get the girls, but there you go. He served on Washington's staff during the Revolutionary War. We talked about that when we talked about Washington in section 2. He studied law. He had a successful law practice in New York. And then he was in the New York legislature. He wrote all the papers, 51 of the Federalist Papers. And then Washington is like, hey, I want you know a lot about economics, come and be on my cabinet. So he was like, wow, we are in a real economics dilemma, 1780s. How do we solve this? And he proposed something kind of crazy and radical. And I think if you've seen I haven't seen, I'm the only one of you who has not seen the show Hamilton, but I think he comes across as kind of like a little, out there, wild, like kind of let's do things differently thing. So he was like, okay, look, states have enormous amounts of debt because during the American Revolution, they basically asked for volunteers to come be in the militia. And then they gave them guns and ammo and food and shelter and all that stuff like Valley Forge in the winter and, boats to cross the river and all this other stuff. And if they were going to take stuff like, you can't farm. So they paid their soldiers, hopefully, or they gave them ammunition or whatever it was, right? They basically each state took on that debt. And they had that challenge was that they now owed a lot of money. Each state individually, many of the states owed a lot of money. How did they address that? Well, often they raised taxes, which was not popular. Witness Shays Rebellion. That was not a popular thing. So Hamilton writes a report. He's really a big writer, right? Hamilton writes this report for the House of Representatives in 1790 about state debt and how to pay off that state debt. It was called public credit. They owed money and they needed to pay this off. It was $25 million in state debt, and that didn't include the $54 million that the feds owed people, like other countries and stuff like that. Okay, so it's a huge debt, even in today's money, let alone back in that money. And his solution was crazy and radical. And he said, okay, states, you don't have to worry about your debt anymore. Federal government will pay for it. How does that even work? Well, this is where we pause and talk about economics for a second. So what he proposed was essentially selling something called a bond. I've put a picture of a modern bond up on up here on the top left. Here it looks maybe a little bit like an American dollar, but also really kind of not. It is a physical piece of paper, and it basically, in economics, a bond is something that a government or a private company goes out into the public marketplace, whether that's in today's world electronic, or in the old days like literally at marketplaces and whatever, and they walk around. The representative from the government or from the company walks around and says, I have here this bond, this piece of paper. I have one downstairs in the safe. I should get that. I have this piece of paper. I will give you this piece of paper. It's like an IOU. And anybody who, let's say it's the picture is $1,000 bond. So they say, this is a worthless piece of paper. I just printed it out myself. I'm going to give it to you, rich person. And you, rich person, are going to trade me this worthless little piece of paper for $1,000 of American money. Why would you do that? Well, because for the next, let's say it's a 10-year bond, for every year for the next 10 years, I'm going to make interest payments to you. I'm going to give you $20. So you lend me $1,000, and every year I'm going to give you 20. So at the end of those, 10 years or whatever, I've given you 10 times, I've given you $20 back. And you're like, yeah, but that's only $200. I gave you 1,000, you gave me 200. You still owe me $800. Well, the thing about a bond is at the end of the time limit, whatever that time limit is, and you can set your time limit for whatever amount of time you want. Usually it's 10 years or 20 years. The company or the government agrees to give you back all the money that you gave them. So if I'm a rich person and I give the government $1,000, I not only get little periodic monies back, but I get my full $1,000 back at the end of those 10 years. So I've now made I've gotten back my $1,000 and kind of for free, for assuming the risk of giving someone money for 10 years, I've basically made hundreds of dollars for that thing. Now, what's the advantage? Well, if you're the investor, if you have enough money, you can just kind of lend it out and then you get your money back kind of at the end of that time plus extra. And if you are the government or the company that is selling these bonds, asking people to give you get a very quick cash influx that you can use to do all kinds of stuff. And hopefully in those intervening 10 or 20 years, you can start lots of companies and do, lots of things and raise lots of taxes and make money so that when those bonds come due 10 or 20 years down the line, you can afford to pay them back. Hamilton said, look, if rich people are willing to lend us money like that, then it will legitimize the federal government. People will understand that all these rich people trust that the United States will be around 10 or 20 years from now. And they trust this so much, they have so much faith that their money will get paid back, that the US will continue to be a country, that it will thrive and prosper, and they'll get their money back, that they're willing to risk their own money to get this done. That was half of it. The other half of it, so he thought it would really legitimize, like, hey, look, all these rich people, they think we're going to survive. You should believe in us too. The other flip side of that is that Hamilton thought, you know what, if rich people have money invested in it, they're going to try to do everything to make sure they get their money back and support the new government. So they're going to make sure that they don't, badmouth or be a traitor or, leave or whatever. They will be invested in helping the United States succeed as a country. So if you have any questions, throw them into chat or unmute and ask them, or send Decker or I a text or an email later. But essentially, that was Hamilton's kind of crazy, wild proposal. Hey, I know we just made a government 5.5 minutes ago, but we're going to sell government bonds and people are going to buy them, and states, so many people are going to buy bonds that we will have enough money to pay off your creditors. Anybody who lent you money during the time, or if you owe money to farmers, if you owe money to soldiers, if you owe money to, other states, we'll take care of it. You will no longer owe that money. We'll pay it off for you. No, dog, sorry. Okay, this is a really controversial idea. First of all, where are the rich people? Well, a lot of them are in the north, like in Massachusetts. So a lot of the people that the government would be indebted to were from the northern part of the United States, of the 13 colonies, and had an agenda that might not match the southern part. Not only that, but Hamilton himself was connected to all these people with money. So the people who would be investing, who could stand, we're not talking $1,000, maybe they'd lend them $100,000 or more. So the people who were going to be getting back their $100,000 plus interest over the years, many of them were directly connected to Alexander Hamilton, like his father-in-law. That was, usually we frown on that. Usually we don't really want people in the government whose relatives, we actually have clauses that try to prevent that kind of stuff. Second of all, I keep looking at the time because I want to make sure I'm good here. I'll go for another couple of minutes. Second of all, some states had already taken care of their own debts. And just like, how we have this discussion about whether we should forgive student loans, and people are like, I paid off my student loan. That's not fair. That's not right that you get forgiven and I didn't. Some states were like, look, we already figured this out. Just because you haven't figured it out, you're a loser. We're better. Like Virginia, North Carolina, we're like, no, you can be a grown-up and pay off your own loans. And Massachusetts and South Carolina, that owed a lot of money, were like, woohoo, let's do this. And so Hamilton wrote in his report that he was presenting to Congress that paying off these debts was just the price of liberty. That's what it cost to be free, was to sell these kinds of bonds. So Hamilton ends up negotiating a deal that was like tit for tat, trade this in response to that. We now call this log rolling. This is not a term that is in this particular section of SOCI, but it is in econ. Log rolling comes from the idea that in like logging communities, there are actual like where you chop down trees, logging communities, there are games that people play. This is actually a very true statement. And one of them is log rolling, where two people stand on a tree that is been like a telephone pole, like it's been chopped down and it is floating in the water like sideways, like a log. And two people stand on it, and one runs one way and the other one runs the other way, and they try, like, as it's in the water and they're like spinning this way and that way, and the winner is the one who's still standing on the log when the other one falls off into the water, and the water's, you know, only a couple feet deep. But this is what log rolling is all about. It's the idea that one person's doing one thing and the other person is doing something else, and they both are trying to work the system from either side. So Hamilton is like, look, I really want to pass this economic deal. What can I do to convince the southern states that this is a good idea? So he knew that the northern states, I know that South Carolina is not a northern state, but he knew the northern states that stood to benefit financially from this deal were really like, yay, go this deal. The southern states, a lot of them were like Virginia and North Carolina were like, no, that's really dumb. I don't want to do that. And so he was like, hey, I have this great idea. If you vote for my plan for this, this economic plan that will pay off the state debt using federal money, I know we're looking for where to build the United States Capitol. Like, it could be New York City, could be Philadelphia. Those were both places where during Section 2 and earlier in Section 3, there had been gatherings of politicians, right, in charge, trying to figure things out. Remember that the British are invading New York City. They keep having to move the government farther and farther north. And so he says, okay, how about we put the new seat of government to the south. It is so fitting that today's art lecture that Decker is going to do is about the US Capitol building that comes about as a direct result of this, because they're going to build it in this sort of weird, like, unincorporated area called what's now called Washington, the District of Columbia. So I am going to play this literally 1-minute video, and then we will go from there.
1 Minute History. The first Congress of the newly established United States is hopelessly deadlocked on two critical issues. James Madison and the southern states are pushing to move the seat of government from New York City to a location on the Potomac River outside of Virginia, an idea rejected by Northerners. Alexander Hamilton leads the northern states, who want to create a national bank and pay off the state's debts from the American Revolution. Southerners oppose the assumption of debt, fearing the idea of a strong centralized national government. Thomas Jefferson invites Hamilton and Madison to dinner at his estate and helps broker a compromise. Southerners will not block legislation on the assumption of state debts if Northerners support the relocation of the seat of government. Passage of the Residence and Funding Acts of 1790 establishes U.S. credit at home and abroad, which allows Thomas Jefferson, as president in 1803, to finance the Louisiana Purchase.
The Louisiana Purchase is not part of the packet at all, but it was called the dinner party. And basically it was where they agreed that, okay, yes, Lewis and Clark, the year that Clemens was born. It basically was like, okay, if you agree to create a national bank and pay off our debts with this public credit, the northern states will agree to put the capital in the South. And I think I'll wrap that up by saying that I think it was incredibly important because, unlike today, where sort of distance doesn't matter. I mean, look at us right now. We have somebody in Arizona, somebody in New York. Josie sometimes joined us from the Philippines, right? We had people. Aiden was just in LA, not last time we were there. Now we have technology, so the distance kind of doesn't matter as much. But that was not true, of course, in 1790, and it really was symbolic of, because remember that these were all separate states, but in many ways they were almost like little miniaturized separate nations. So where you put your capital and the access that people had to the physical building of the Capitol, and where the legislature would meet, and the Supreme Court, and the president, where all of these communities lived, was insanely important and incredibly symbolic as to where you were aligned. You know, if you put think about it in terms of this world right now, think about what it would mean if the United States put a capital in a different country, in Canada, in Mexico, in Japan, in India, in Switzerland, in Russia. We get that a little bit with what city our embassies should be in, but if you imagine that I just listed all those countries, each one of them evoked a different emotion for you in terms of whether you thought that was a good idea or not, and what that would imply if your capital was in one of those countries. And the same thing was true back in the late 1780s in terms of where this capital should be, because each of those states had such a different character and was still so independent. So that is where we need, and I think we will end and take our break there and start with the Whiskey Rebellion when we come back. So let me stop my share here. It is, we got some more people. I'm always so excited. Okay, so it's 5:55. I do have to feed the dog. That is what is drama happening right up here. Let me pause the recording, and when we come back,
pause the recording. Sorry. Dad joke.
Dad joke. I love it. Okay, I will say, like, Decker and I don't plan how far we'll get on any of the days or what we'll cover or whatever, but you can see why we like to start with the SOSI and how perfectly the art is integrated with the SOSI, especially at this point. I mean, so sometimes we get the weird like buffalo skin thing, but every once in a while, it just lines up perfectly. And today, like, yeah, of course we planned that. Of course, I planned to tell you that the Hamilton money compromise ended with also the log rolling so that we got the Capitol in on the Potomac River, where my oldest child goes to school, right there, although she's not there. All right.
And there's nothing that happened 220 years ago that is pertinent to today at all.
At all.
Right?
Oh my
God. No dovetailing curriculum with current events. I mean, it's just all ancient history. Don't worry about it.
It's so crazy. I mean, look at that whole thing. And now we have access to, our bodies. Or maybe not. All right. Stop, pause the recording. And 4:57, so 5:07. So I'm resuming recording. And before Decker gets started, I looked up all the dates just really quickly. So 1787, it kind of gets spread out. 1787, they start voting to ratify the Constitution, and the no one wants to amend it right away, partly because they're afraid that amendments mean changing the structure of what they were trying to vote on. So they didn't want to change the proposed idea of like a bicameral house of legislation and a Supreme Court and an executive power and checks and balances and all that other stuff. But when they realized that all the states were not going to ratify it without a Bill of Rights, they said, okay, ratify it while we simultaneously etch out what we think we need, what rights we think we need to add. And we promise that if you ratify it, we will add amendments to it. So 1787 is when they start ratifying the Constitution. 1788 is when it goes into effect with 9 states voting on it and supporting it. But not all states have voted on it yet. And they've taken those 19 amendments, put it back to 12, and whatever, and kicked those out to the states kind of simultaneously, like, okay, you ratified it. What do you want to add? Okay, you haven't ratified it at all. What do you think of it? Blah, 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 blah. So it goes into like all of that goes into effect by 1791. Enough states have now voted on the Bill of Rights so that officially is part of it. So while the Constitution goes into effect in 88 because of the number of states that have ratified it, and the Bill of Rights goes into effect 3 years later, it was not a do this, done, now do this. It was literally getting, worked on, kind of building an airplane in flight, we say. So there were states that hadn't voted on it yet. There were states that had voted on it, but were still debating the amendments. There were states that were debating the amendment, had been fully in support of it, but like the amendments anyway. There were states that had, were not going to vote to support it until it had the amendments on it. So it was a process. And maybe that answers the question. So that it was not going, they knew it was not going to get accepted. And one of the reasons I just read in the history, the official federal website, was Madison liked he was such a Federalist, he liked the Constitution so much that he became the author and the champion of the Bill of Rights, in part because he wanted to protect the Constitution as written and didn't want anybody to alter the Constitution in terms of how it governed the essentially nation states that became the United States of America. We think of them as just states. Like I could move to whatever, I want to move to Iowa. I can just literally put my dog in my car and go to Iowa. I don't have to ask anybody permission or anything like that's not a real nation. But they were really at the time so self-governing that, you didn't have to ask permission, but they were all like so different. So it was a process. And, of course, part of it was also they still had the Articles of Constitution or of Confederacy. So those were like kind of not doing well, but that was okay. So that's what happened. It was a multi-year process starting in 1787 when the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were publishing their papers, Mason going no, and Hamilton and Jay and going yes, writing all these papers. And so it was like a dialogue for the next 4 years as different states did different things.
And as Decker keeps pointing out, the communication and everything took so much longer. So
right. So you could say, oh, I'm doing this, but could take months before your legislature convened. Right. All right, so Decker, I'm sorry that it is already 5:12. You feel free to take as long as you need to, and if you need to start
6:15. This will go to maybe 7:15. Well, I'll try.
Perfect. All right.
It's all good. All right, let's see. I'm such a boomer. All right, let's see how. That's it. That's where I want to be. So last time we're finishing up the Monticello, and now we're on the Capitol, as we've been saying, and it's Capitol with a capital C, but not a capital. Well, you get the idea. So what's going on here? They're talking about where should our seat of government be, and a lot of people are for Philadelphia because it's more established city, and we'll talk about that some later. But what happened was a tract of land was ceded from Maryland to create the District of Columbia, which was the area that was selected to be the site of the U.S. Capitol. And this is the U.S. Capitol, designed by Pierre L'Enfant. He was hired to plan the whole city. Oh, I didn't mention that the act that established the legality of getting this piece of land for Maryland and putting the United States Capitol here, this was the Residence Act. And they mention it just in passing in the Art Resource Guide. And the Residence Act was passed by Congress in 1790. If you want to read more about the Residence Act, I have it linked to it. It's basically an act for establishing the temporary and permanent seat of the government of the United States, and talks all about it, but they're not going to test you on it. So you can read that to your heart's content. So they wound up getting Pierre L'Enfant. He was hired to plan the new city. And he had actually worked with Washington during the Revolutionary War. And so Washington liked him. And so everybody was really happy with this. And Pierre L'Enfant is actually the one who determined where the US Capitol building should be for the US Capitol. Remember, there's Capitol with an AL and Capitol with an OL. So you determine the location for our Capitol building and our Capitol on the edge of Jenkins Hill, which is the east end of the National Mall. And for those of you who have not been to Washington, D.C., this is the National Mall. And there in the distance is our Capitol with a TOL, right? Here's Washington Monument, Lincoln, right? And all these other buildings, we'll talk about those later, but this is when they talk about the mall area. This is the mall area. And our Capitol building back here, that's our architectural subject matter for this lecture. So on the edge of Jenkins Hill, so this is literally up on a hill. Small hill, very small hill. You can see there's not a large tilt, but when you're walking up there, you do realize that you were walking uphill. L'Enfant was dismissed before any of the plans were produced. They don't talk a lot about this in the Art Resource Guide, and I spent quite a lot of time reading about all these different people who then worked underneath L'Enfant, and they'd keep getting fired, and they'd go through one guy, another guy, another guy, and the Art Resource Guide doesn't mention it. They're not going to test it, but it wasn't as simple as they're projecting or presenting. L'Enfant had a really lot of interesting ideas, but it would have cost a whole lot of money, and more money than our new government was willing to pay for all these different structures in the Capitol. So at this time, Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State for George Washington. And as Secretary of State, he had an idea. They've dismissed Pierre L'Enfant. They said, who should we get to further this design? And they decided to have a competition, a design competition. $500 winning prize. And I've got an asterisk here to remind me that the winning prize also came with a plot of land to build a building on. So in other words, you get $500 plus some land in the Capitol, capital AL, okay? And there was a winner, but he won't be credited as the only architect of the Capitol. In full, we're on our 11th architect of the Capitol. There's constant renovating going on throughout the 200 years. So the guy we're going to talk about, this is his design right here, what won the contest. This design right here. And he's known as our first architect, Dr. William Thornton. He did this in 1793. Now remember that Mrs. Scully was just talking about history and mentioning a lot what was going on in 1787. So this is just a few years after that. He's the first architect. Thornton was Scottish trained physician, amateur architect living in Tortola, British West Indies. His plan included a low dome over a temple flanked by rectangular wings on the north and south, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Low dome. President Washington praised the winning submission for its grandeur, simplicity, and convenience. Washington also laid the cornerstone of the building himself that year, and they've got this cornerstone plaque, which they've tried to find. I went down the rabbit hole of finding the original cornerstone with a plaque on it buried somewhere underneath. They've been looking for it. Very interesting. A little bit about Thornton. I want to show you more of his face here. This is Dr. William Thornton. He was a doctor, right? Amateur architect, honored as the first architect because his design was accepted by President George Washington. He got $500 and, again, like I said with the asterisk, a building lot in the city of Washington for his composition. He held no government position as a result of winning the architectural composition. We could give his birth and everything, but they're not going to test you on it. He was living in the British West Indies. We could also talk about 3 men hired to oversee the construction. The Art Resource Guide does not mention Stephen Hallett, George Hadfield, James Hoban. Not going to belabor these people because the Art Resource Guide does not even mention them. Just so you know, it was a very convoluted thing. Each architect, the Capitol, helped shape the iconic buildings and grounds we know today, not just the Capitol building itself, but the grounds, which we're going to get into later. Very, very interesting. And as we see, we're going to have another guy. Oh, this cornerstone link. Here's when you can get into the first cornerstone laid on Wednesday, September 18, 1793. Again, the Art Resource Guide does not talk about this. During the first large public event staged in the federal city. The Art Resource Guide does mention Washington laying the first cornerstone. This is literally a stone that was laid, and Washington probably had a ceremonial hammer that went tap, tap, and then these guys are doing all the work, actually laying the stone. But hey, there you go. It's like taking a bottle of champagne and whacking it against a big ocean liner and launching the ship. And yeah, your little bottle launched the ship. Probably not. So you have this big, huge ceremony, and very first large public event. Newspaper clipping talking about it. They describe exactly how it worked. People rejoicing, and very interesting. And when you read more on this, it becomes really, really interesting. They had this inscription, and it was handed to Washington. He stepped down into a foundation trench, laid the plate on the ground, lowered the cornerstone onto this plate. With the president were Joseph Clark and 3 worshipful masters bearing the corn, wine, and oil used to consecrate the stone. Corn, wine, and oil. Chanting accompanied Washington's ascent from the trench. In other words, he had a Masonic ritual. George Washington was a Mason, and they had these weird mystical type rituals that went along with this. Following the formal exercises, a 500-pound ox was barbecued, and those in attendance generally partook, and every abundance of other recreation. By dark, the festivities had ended. In 1991, a search for the Capitol cornerstone was conducted, including use of a metal detector to locate the engraved plate, and it was not found. Location may be under the southeast corner of what is today National Statuary Hall. We'll get into that in a little bit. So they tried to find it, couldn't, but it happened. So there you go. The second architect was one Benjamin Henry Latrobe. He was born in Leeds, England, 1764. He was hired by President Jefferson in 1803 to oversee the ongoing construction. So remember, Washington, he was president for 2 terms, and Adams was president. Now Jefferson's president. Capitol building takes a long time to be constructed. Latrobe studied architecture and engineering with Samuel Pepys Cockerell and John Smeaton. He immigrated to the United States in 1796. This would be after the cornerstone was laid, 3 years after. Latrobe's projects included St. John's Church down here in Washington, D.C.'s Lafayette Square, and the neoclassical Bank of Pennsylvania. Latrobe added a grand staircase to the original Capitol plan, along with a Corinthian colonnade along the east front of the building. When we take a look at the building, I'll point out these different parts. What are Corinthian colonnades? What are colonnades? The technical definition of a colonnade is a long row of columns that supports a roof and or creates an arcade. This would be a really short colonnade here. We have much longer ones when we're talking about the Capitol building. So a little bit about Latrobe before we move on to 1811. Here's Latrobe, looking very intellectual. Again, hired by Jefferson in 1803. Construction halted July 1st, 1811. hired by President James Madison, April 6, 1815, resigned later on in 1817. There's a lot of confusing gaps here. We'll try to fill these in. Latrobe, hired by President Jefferson in 1803 to fill the position of surveyor of public buildings with the principal responsibility of constructing the Capitol's south wing. He was also responsible for work at the President's House and the Navy Yard. After the south wing was completed in 1807, Latrobe began reconstructing the interior of the north wing. Construction funds were withheld after 1810, and Latrobe's public employment came to an end. So they're running out of money. Funding run out. Latrobe leaves because, hey, he's not going to get paid. What the heck? And then, dun, 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 we will now have a brief pause of silence for the War of 1812. You can read all about the War of 1812 here, but we're not going to get tested on it. It was a lot of burning buildings. I jump ahead here, and I'm going to come back to some stuff. If you're reading along in the Art Resource Guide, the destruction of the Capitol, they describe sort of non-chronologically, so I moved it to this point in time. So the destruction of the Capitol, meaning the Capitol building, was in August 1814 during the War of 1812. These dates can get confusing because the Capitol was destroyed in 1814 during the War of 1812. Sounds kind of weird, but the War of 1812 started in 1812. Actually, it started in 1811, and it took more than a few years to finish. Anyway, what you need to remember is that British troops under the command of Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross, they attacked the city of Washington. The residents knew it was coming. They got the heck out of there. If you recall, Dolly Madison took a portrait painted of Washington out of the White House in order to save it and said, don't let this fall into enemy hands, destroy it if you have to. Anyway, this was a retaliatory move. British didn't just all of a sudden come to the United States, say, you know what, they've been building this Capitol long enough, let's raise it to the ground. They set fire to the Capitol because American troops had burned the Canadian Capitol at York in the previous year. And the Canadians and the British are still working together. And so it's like, okay, you burn the Canadian Capitol, we're going to come down and burn the US Capitol. Tit for tat. So not unexpected. The British set fire to the Capitol, the White House, the Navy Yard, and several American warships. The Capitol at the time was still under construction, right? Latrobe had not finished. They ran out of funds before he finished. There was considerable damage to the north and south wings. British set fires in several rooms using piled up furniture, documents, and books from the Library of Congress. The reason why that was so easy to do is back at that time, the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress were both housed in the Capitol. They're no longer housed in the Capitol. They have their separate buildings. But back then, everything was there. And they had 3,000 books. That number is, I don't know whether that's in the resource guide or not. I read it. There were 3,000 books, and they took them all and a bunch of other documents. They lit them on fire, and they torched the place. This is a fairly accurate picture of what happened. The interior damage was extensive. Luckily, many of the building materials were fireproof. Remember, USAD loves questions like, all of the following were materials that were fireproof used in the building of the Capitol, except, right? So all of these were iron, marble, sandstone, zinc, copper. Really hard to burn this stuff, okay? So luckily, Latrobe used these 5 building materials, and that's why they were able to restore the burnt interior of the Capitol. The exterior was still, the structure of it was still there. So they didn't have to totally start from scratch. And if you want to know more about these materials, this is a really interesting page. There was lots of interesting quotes about this. In retaliation of the Americans' recent burning the Canadian Capitol at York, today Toronto. British troops descended on Washington, D.C. to set fire to much of the city. Follow the 1814 path the British took to burn the U.S. Capitol and learn more about damage done to this historic building. And one senator was quoted as saying, "a most magnificent ruin." Here's our picture around 8 p.m. It gives this all, clearly the art resource guide got all this stuff from here because there's a lot of direct quotes here. Horrifying spectacle. The British torched major rooms in the Capitol, which then housed the Library of Congress, was where's the House, Senate, Supreme Court, the White House, the Navy Yard. Several American warships were also burned. Most private property were spared. They were going for governmental property. Architect Latrobe had used fireproof building materials such as sheet iron, marble, sandstone, zinc, copper. His extensive use of masonry vaulting also proved to be practical as well as aesthetic. So the exterior structure survived. Many of the interior spaces remained intact. They hit the major principal rooms, foregoing the lobbies, halls, and staircases, thus securing their escape route. If you'd lit everything on fire while you're still inside the building and there's no way to get out, not smart. So these guys were smart. They actually, the soldiers ignited a giant bonfire of furniture slathered with gunpowder paste. I didn't even know gunpowder paste existed. Evidently it does, or it did. So slather it in gunpowder paste, light it up. There you go. The heat from the fire grew so intense that it melted the glass skylights and destroyed much of the carved stone in the room. This is the National Statuary Hall, which we've mentioned twice now. We'll get it thrice, including Giuseppe Franzoni's life-sized marble statue of Liberty seated on a pedestal located above the speaker's rostrum. Remember, the British have no love lost on the French, in this case, the Italian, and liberty is a French concept. So there you go. Clerk's office transformed into an inferno. Here's what they did in the Supreme Court. There's the 3,000 books from the Library of Congress, served as a ready stockpile of fuel. Yeah, there's the quote. Upon seeing the flames of the Capitol from his temporary residence, the Octagon House, remember those octagons in Monticello? French Minister Louis Serrurier remarked, "I have never beheld a spectacle more terrible and at the same time more magnificent." They're really, really fascinating. So after the burning, Latrobe comes back and he helps with the restoration. Due to extensive destruction of Washington, D.C., some congressmen advocated moving the federal government to Philadelphia. But there was a resurgence of national pride, and everybody says, darn it, we're not going to let them chase us out of here. So they kept building things in Washington, D.C. Latrobe returned in 1814 to help with restoration. He was responsible for some of the building's best known interior spaces, including the National Statuary Hall. Gee, I wonder why it's called that. This is just gorgeous. I visited here in 2011 and got to see all this. Really cool. The old Senate chambers. They're the old Senate chambers right here. No, sorry. This is the Senate chambers right here. The old Supreme Court is right here. Again, they're no longer in there. So these are the old ones. And the domed top lit halls resemble similar features in temples such as the Pantheon. That's why I've got a picture of the Pantheon in Rome. This is all mentioned in the Art Resource Guide, and you can look at each one of these places. I love looking at, I'm looking at the time here and say, well, we'll come back. But the National Statuary Hall consists of 100 statues contributed by 50 states, 2 statues from each. Makes sense? So you can check out California statues. I checked out Arizona statues. All the statues in this collection are viewed, the list by location in the Capitol. That's kind of cool. So you can look at all the different statues. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. The old Senate chamber, the old Supreme Court chamber. Fascinating. Guys, I highly, highly recommend you taking a look at more of your country's history. The third architect in our chain of architects, and by the way, between the beginning and today, 2022, there have been 11 architects. We're really only covering the 3 main guys here because of the time period involved. So the third architect, one Charles Bulfinch, 1818. Bulfinch is the first official architect of the Capitol that was actually born in the United States. He was born in Boston in 1763. Now, he was born in Boston before Boston was technically in the United States, because there was no United States, because we hadn't had the war yet, we hadn't had the Constitution yet, any of that. But he was born in the domestic area. He was a Harvard graduate. He worked in New England for much of his career. He's best known for his design for the Massachusetts State House. Okay, cool. Oh, look, it's columns supporting a roof. We have another colonnade type idea here. Anyway, we'll get more to describing these. Ooh, look, these are Corinthian columns. How do I know that? We'll get to that in a second. So Bulfinch contributed the design of the iconic dome center building, the Capitol grounds, and the West Terraces. This was the original dome design by Bulfinch. See, it kind of looks like an old German, I wouldn't say World War I hat. It's
I was going to say a pith helmet.
Yeah, kind of look like that. Hundreds of skilled and unskilled laborers worked on this project for decades, including enslaved African Americans. The African Americans are the ones who quarried the stone used for the floors, the walls, and the columns. They're the ones who made and laid the bricks. They're the ones that sawed the wood. They're the ones that framed the building. And there's an historic marker made from sandstone quarried by slaves during construction that was installed to acknowledge their contributions. By the way, Bulfinch link. This is all from the same website, but it just sort of made it easier, went right to them. So this is Bulfinch, hired by the Commissioner of Public Buildings in 1818, continued the restoration of the 2 wings, which were reopened in 1819. So they're destroyed in 1814. 5 years later, they were able to finally reopen them. He designed the Dome Center building, the U.S. Capitol, and oversaw its construction between 1818 and 1826. So even though it was reopened in 1819, it wasn't really finished until 1826. He also planned the U.S. Capitol grounds and the original West Terraces. After the U.S. Capitol building was finished, President Andrew Jackson terminated the architect's position on June 30th, 1829. All of these architects must have been difficult to get along with because they all got fired at one time or another. The U.S. Capitol grounds, I find this absolutely fascinating. They're not going to test you on this. It's a 58-acre park originally landscaped by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1874. So it's more than 50 years past when we're going to talk about. It was named an accredited arboretum in 2017. And it talks about, there's this nice little video here, talks about how many trees and plants. And again, it talks about, in contrast, and this is why I bring this up, the grounds with all the trees and the plants and the shrubbery are in contrast to the building's straight neoclassical lines. Remember that this section of the artwork is talking about neoclassical architecture. So they're saying the grounds around the building are in contrast to that neoclassical architecture, meaning instead of straight lines, most of the walkways in the grounds are curved. Benches along the paths offer pleasant spots for visitors to appreciate the building, its landscape, and surrounding areas, most notably the National Mall to the west. This is a nice little video. If we have time, we can come back and look at it. But again, we're not going to get tested on this.
Did you see that my mom wrote that Olmsted also designed Central Park in New York City?
Yes, I had read that. I had not read it because when I have this up in this form, I can't see the chat. So I'm trusting you to keep chatting everyone up. So embedded within the Capitol's architecture are details that ground neoclassical building within its North American setting. In other words, we're going to be neoclassical. In other words, we're going to take a look at ancient Greek and Roman architecture, but we're going to tweak it. Okay? Upon close examination of the interior Corinthian columns designed by Latrobe, reveals that the traditional acanthus leaves, which would have been used in ancient Greece and Rome, have been replaced with corn cobs and tobacco leaves. So this is a nod to local agriculture. We grow corn here, we grow tobacco here. And so we're going to design it using these ancient, classic, neoclassical, revisiting Greece and Rome, but we're going to update it with local stuff. I want to deviate here really quickly. On page 13 and 14, really, you go back and read, you got to start reading parts of section 1 of the Art Resource Guide. On page 14 is this diagram talking about columns, and I want to briefly talk about this. The original Greek Doric columns were wider at the bottom and narrower at the top. They had grooves known as flutes, sort of fluted columns. They had no base. And by the time we went from Doric to Greek Ionic are more straight rather than gradually getting larger. They had a definitive base. This is called the shaft of the column. And at the top, above the shaft, but still part of the column itself, they added a decorative capital. And this is capital with an AL, not capitol with an OL. So less ornate Doric, a little bit more ornate Ionic, along with a base, and more of a straight up and down rather than getting larger. This area up in here is known as the entablature. And we mentioned the entablature going around Monticello. Then we move on to Corinthian. And notice Corinthian looks very much like Ionic. They tend to be narrower, but then when it gets to the capital, it's much more ornate. And then later on, they decide, let's just go smooth. That's called Tuscan. Let's get less ornate. The Romans sort of, they're looking back at Greek and say, well, we really like Doric, but we're going to call it the Roman Doric. It's sort of a combination between Greek Doric and Ionic. And then we're going to sort of throw everything together, a little bit of Ionic, a little bit of Doric, a little bit of Corinthian, and we're going to call it a composite. So this is just all briefly described on page 14 of your Art Resource Guide, and I wanted to kind of go over it. So, where were we? We were here. So you can see this design, and this is the capital with an AL inside the capitol with an OL in Washington, D.C., which is a capital with an AL of our country. And you can see how this can get confusing to people. There are also many, many things within the building, right? And they mentioned 4 sandstone relief panels that were created and installed above the doorways of the rotunda. This all happened between 1825 and 1827. Each of these relief panels mythologizes the relationship between the colonial settlers and the native North Americans. They mention all 4 of them in the Art Resource Guide. The first one is Antonio Capellano's relief titled The Preservation of Captain Smith by Pocahontas. And of course, this depicts Native Americans rescuing John Smith. This, of course, depicting an event that happened in 1606, one of 4 relief panels featuring scenes from American colonial history. Now, the Art Resource Guide talks about different types of relief. Relief is a type of sculpture, but it's not what's known as a freestanding sculpture. Freestanding sculptures, you can walk all the way around, look at them from a 360-degree point of view and see it from all these different angles. With relief, it's like, well, if I tried to walk around this, I'd see the other side of a wall or a plaque if this isn't on a wall, and I wouldn't see anything, right? So you don't really view it from one side. It sticks out, right? Based on how much it sticks out from the background. If it's really stuck out far, it's in high relief. If it's really close to the background, it's in low relief. BAS, relief, BAS. You can see some of these characters are more three-dimensional because they're coming out of the background more. You know, this guy's leg is coming out of the background more, whereas this guy's leg back here is more, you know, stuck to the actual background. So this is
this a story that everybody knows but me?
Oh, you don't know John Smith and Polka? Didn't you see
I saw
Pocahontas
the
Disney
Disney
film?
movie. Yeah, maybe. But what if that? Oh, was somebody trying to kill him and she saved him?
Yeah, kind of, sort of.
Okay.
Yeah,
maybe.
because she was in
maybe.
love and all that. I mean, wow. Hey, we're gonna have to get Paula on this. She just left you with a huge gap in your required, you know, education.
Apparently, yep. All right. Well, I know William Penn's Treaty with the Indians. We just studied that one.
Yeah, right. Only this is right. Since these things were real events, so obviously more than one artist can depict these real events. So earlier we studied a painting that was depicting William Penn's treaty with the Indians. This is a relief, a sandstone relief panel created and installed above the doorways of the rotunda. There's 4 of them. This is by Nicholas Javelot. And this depicts the Native Americans agreeing to a land deal with William Penn. Well, we talked about this, but now instead of a big, huge painting, here's the relief panel. Instead of a whole bunch of people, it's just 3 people. It's the same idea. It's still, hey, we're taking all your land for not very much, but there you go. There's also 2 more works, both done by the same man, one Enrico Cassisi. One is The Landing of the Pilgrims, which depicts the Native Americans providing food for the newly arriving pilgrims. And the other one is The Conflict of Daniel Boone and the Indians, which depicts Native Americans battling and being subdued by Daniel Boone. So here's The Landing of the Pilgrims. We're getting the punchline at the bottom of the slide. This event occurred in 1620. Again, one of 4 relief panels. So the pilgrims are landing, and here are the Indians. Hey, have some corn. So glad to meet you. And the conflict of Daniel Boone and the Indians, which would have occurred around 1773, much later. Daniel Boone fighting the Indians. And all of this is quite illuminating because in 1842, a representative of Virginia described the implicit inequitable subtext of these 4 panels thusly: we give you corn, you cheat us of our lands. We save your life, you take ours. And there you go. It's like, there you go. It pretty much says it all. It pretty much says it all. We save your life. We give you corn. And there you go. So that's cool. So again, this is in the rotunda, which is in the Capitol. These are sandstone relief panels above the doorways of the rotunda. Pretty cool, pretty cool. Meanwhile, on top of the dome, as you walk up looking at the Capitol building, is this Statue of Freedom. But it's not either one of these, because these are the plaster casts that were originally designed to make a bronze casting out of them. We're going to get into this in a second. Remember, neoclassical, the ideas of balance, symmetry, and harmony. So when you're looking at this Statue of Freedom, it's all supposed to blend in with this neoclassical mantra: geometric, symmetrical, harmonious architecture of the Capitol was intended to symbolize the unity and consensus of the nation. Guys, if I can pontificate for a moment here, this is why we should all be so offended that our own people stormed this building, stormed these grounds, stormed this building. This is intended to symbolize unity and consensus. This is the last place anyone in this country should want to storm. 1850s. Imagine what was going on in the 1860s, Civil War. What was going on before that? Bloody Kansas and all this strife over slavery, right? 1850s. Controversy over the sculpture designed to sit atop the Capitol's dome, called the Statue of Freedom, which was designed by Thomas Crawford. His original, and actually this is the second picture. The original one was slightly different, but I like this one better for the purpose of pointing things out. This second version, he had an idealized female figure wearing a liberty cap. Senator Jefferson Davis objected to this sculpture on the grounds that liberty caps were associated with freed Roman slaves. Jefferson Davis, who went on to become the president of the Confederacy, right, 10, 12 years later, he took the symbolism to be an abolitionist message. Yeah. Anyway, Crawford replaced the liberty cap with a feathered Native American headdress. Crawford created a model in 1857 out of plaster for the sculpture in a Rome studio, and he shipped it to Washington for it to be cast in bronze. But he died soon after and never saw the statue itself installed. He never saw the bronze casting, never saw it on top of the Capitol dome. So the statue was cast by Carl Mills with the assistance of Philip Reed. Now, anybody who's in Decathlon the last few years should know who Carl Mills was. I'll let some of you ponder that name for a moment. Reed, we're going to get back to Carl Mills later. Philip Reed was an enslaved laborer. He actually did the casting, even though it was under supervision by Carl Mills, who was the artist, okay? Cast at the bronze foundry outside of Washington. Reed worked on the project for over a year, beginning in 1861. Think about what's going on around 1861 in our country. The sculpture arrived from Italy in 5 pieces. So this came in 5 pieces. An Italian sculptor was hired to assemble it. The instructions weren't from IKEA, but I couldn't resist. It was a disaster. When it came time to cast the individual parts, the foundry could not determine how to separate the pieces. So Reed, the slave, devised a pulley system to disassemble the sculpture and have it not break in the incorrect spots. By April 16, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Compensated Emancipation Act, banning slavery in the District of Columbia, which of course was where Philip Reed was. So Reed was freed and was a free man when the Statue of Freedom was installed atop the Capitol Dome in 1863. And by the way, for the longest time, I thought that this little star here was some artifact. It's like they put it in there. It's like, no, if you look up close, there's stars all around the head, and it's the sun glinting off of this star. Statue of Freedom, classical female figure, long flowing hair, wearing a helmet with a crest composed of an eagle's head and feathers. She wears a classical dress secured with a brooch inscribed US. Over it is draped a heavy flowing toga-like robe fringed with fur and decorative balls. Her right hand rests upon the hilt of a sheathed sword wrapped in a scarf. In her left hand, she holds a laurel wreath of victory and the shield of the United States with 13 stripes. The helmet is encircled by 9 stars. 10 bronze points tipped with platinum are attached to her headdress, shoulders, and shield for protection from lightning. Who knew? She stands on a cast iron pedestal topped with a globe encircled with the motto E pluribus unum, out of many one. The lower part of the pedestal is decorated with fasces, symbols of authority and government, and wreaths. This is an ancient Roman thing. The pedestal is 18.5 feet high, almost doubles the total height. The crest of Freedom's headdress rises 288 feet above the east front plaza. Does not wear or hold a knitted liberty cap as would have been expected in 19th century art. The knit cap provided to freed slaves in ancient Rome had been adopted as a symbol of liberty or freedom during the American and French revolutions and was usually shown as red. The Statue of Freedom's crested helmet and sword, suggesting she's prepared to protect the nation, are more commonly associated with Minerva or Bellona, Roman goddess of war. The history of the statue's design explains why she wears a helmet rather than a liberty cap. Well, it's also because that one senator complained, not senator, Jefferson Davis complained. The story of her casting reveals that some of the people who worked to create freedom were not themselves free. And I don't know how much time we have left. If you read about Philip Reed, this is a lot of the outline of the design, like detailed workings. This is the Statue of Freedom. Here's the E pluribus unum, and then the fasces, and then here are the pedestal that it's on. 2 feet to an inch. Quite the large pedestal, neoclassical pedestal. And again, when construction of the Capitol began in 1793, Washington, D.C. was little more than a rural landscape with dirt roads and few accommodations beyond a small number of boarding houses. Skilled labor is hard to find or attract to the fledgling city. Enslaved laborers who were rented from their owners were involved in almost every stage of construction. Philip Reed may be the single best known enslaved person associated with the Capitol's construction history. It talks all about Reed. None of this appears in the Art Resource Guide. Many years, I mean, they mention him. They don't give all this deal. Born in 1820, Reed was an enslaved laborer in the foundry run by the self-taught sculptor Clark Mills, who cast the Statue of Freedom. Mills was a former resident of South Carolina, where he purchased Reed in Charleston for $1,200. Mills stated he purchased Reed many years ago when he was quite a youth because of his evident talent for the business in which your petitioner was engaged, and paid $1,200 for him. He brought him with him when he moved to Washington. Mills won a competition for an equestrian statue, that's horse, of Andrew Jackson, commissioned for Lafayette Park. And we get into the whole Statue of Freedom thing. Reed was the only known slave working on Freedom, the Freedom statue. He worked as a laborer alongside of James Riddle, Peter Coyle, Rosin Offutt, and Michael Sheedy. As an enslaved worker, Reed was paid directly for his work on Sundays. His owner received the payment for his work the other 6 days. He was paid at $1.25 a day, higher than the other laborers who received $1 a day. And you can actually go to the daily cost of labor report and how much people got. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. So that was my last slide. I don't know how we're doing on time. It is 5:59. I nailed it. Oh, I wanted to show you one video. So I'm going to go a little bit over. I want to show you, I knew we were going to come back here. This this is the last thing, because it kind of encapsulates everything that we talked about. And it's 5 minutes long. So if you guys can wait till 6:05, we'll be okay.
The United States Capitol Building, the home of American democracy and global symbol of freedom, is one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. The Capitol Building itself reflects the history of America, growing and evolving with the nation since its first cornerstone was laid. The person first credited with the title of architect of the Capitol was Dr. William Thornton. His design for the Capitol was selected by President George Washington in 1793 to be built atop Jenkins Hill. On September 18, 1793, President George Washington laid the cornerstone, but due to the challenges of acquiring the materials and the skilled labor to build the Capitol, by August 1796, the commissioners were forced to focus the entire work effort on the building's north wing so that it could be ready for government occupancy. Even with the focus on the north wing, some third-floor rooms were still unfinished when the Congress, the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress, and the courts of the District of Columbia were moved into the building in 1800. In 1803, Congress allocated funds to resume construction of the Capitol, and Benjamin Henry Latrobe was appointed architect. By 1807, construction on the south wing was sufficiently advanced, so the House was able to occupy its new legislative chamber, and the wing was completed in 1811. By 1813, Latrobe left the Capitol due to funding shortages caused by the War of 1812 with Great Britain. On August 24, 1814, British troops set fire to the building. Only a sudden rainstorm prevented total destruction, creating what Latrobe called a most magnificent ruin. Latrobe returned to Washington in 1815 when he was rehired to restore the Capitol, but was forced to resign shortly after due to consistently missing deadlines and exceeding budgets. Architect Charles Bulfinch, Latrobe's successor, completed the chambers for the Supreme Court, the House, and the Senate, which was ready for use by 1819. Bulfinch also created the long-awaited Center Building, capping it with a copper-covered dome. After completing the dome in 1826, Bulfinch spent the next few years on the Capitol's decoration and landscaping. By 1850, it was apparent that the Capitol could no longer accommodate the increasing numbers of senators and representatives from newly admitted states. Another competition was held for the best plan to extend the Capitol. President Millard Fillmore appointed Philadelphia architect Thomas Hugh Walter, who would design and add two significant wings to the Capitol, housing the Senate on the north side and the House of Representatives on the south. As the new wings were constructed, more than doubling the length of the Capitol, it became apparent that the dome erected by Bulfinch no longer suited the building's proportions. Beginning in 1855, it was decided the old dome should be torn down and a larger cast iron dome, designed by Walter, would replace it. On December 2, 1863, the 19-foot Statue of Freedom was mounted, completing the 287-foot dome. Between 1884 and 1891, the marble terraces on the north, west, and south sides of the Capitol were constructed as part of the grounds plan devised by landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. The next significant alteration to the exterior of the Capitol was initiated in 1958, with a 33-foot extension of the east portico at the center of the building that was first proposed by Walter in 1864. The Capitol Visitor Center is the newest addition to the Capitol. At nearly 580,000 square feet, the Visitor Center is the largest project in the Capitol's more than two-century history and is approximately 3/4 the size of the Capitol itself. The entire facility is located underground on the east side of the Capitol, so as not to detract from the appearance of the Capitol and the grounds designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1874. On December 2, 2008, the anniversary of the placement of the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol Dome, the Capitol Visitor Center opened. Since then, millions of people have visited the Capitol, entering through the Capitol Visitor Center. In the decade ahead, the Capitol will undergo further restoration and improvements, ensuring this iconic building and home of American democracy endures for generations to come.
When was that video created?
Yeah, 12 years
2010.
ago. Yep.
Wild. Wild. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us and for being here. I'm going to stop the recording. I hope you have a great rest of the week. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to contact us or stay around and unmute. And we will see you Monday of next week, Monday the 25th of July. Have a wonderful week.